Welcome everyone to our fifth and last session of the Hebrew Bible in its historical setting. Turn it over to you, Travis.
Thank you very much, Pastor. Okay, so thank you for the grace to have one extra class to deal with the Age of the Prophets, Part 3. We left off last time with Malachi starting his work around about the year 500 BC. Now we're going to head into what's commonly called the Persian period, even though back in the 550s, Cyrus the Great began expanding the kingdom of Persia and eventually creating the Persian Empire. Now they're going to really dominate the next 150 years, 170 years, until the coming of Alexander the Great. Then everything changes. So we're going to try to get through these. There's a lot of things that's going on especially in the Mediterranean world with Greece and Rome. Rome is starting to see their ascendancy, and the great power of Greece is going to be divided thanks to what's called the Peloponnesian War. It's the war between the city-states of Greece and Athens, and it will just bleed them dry. The Persians will see a good opportunity to make a move as Sparta and Athens and their allies are all involved in this national warfare. So let's start in the year 499. We have a guy named Aristagoras in 499 who, acting on behalf of the Persian Empire, leads a failed attack from Greece on this rebellious island of Naxos. That same year, he instigates what's called the Ionian Revolt, and that is the revolt against the Greek powers that are trying to hold on to any control in Ionia. And it's the beginning of the Persian Wars between Greece and Persia. So if we look at image number 1, Pastor, in 496, an important thing, the playwright Sophocles is born. And my favorite quote from him is, "One word frees us of all the weight and pain of life. That word is love." Sophocles is the guy who wrote Oedipus Rex. Actually, it's the Oedipus trilogy, Oedipus cycle, it's called. And he is one of the first great playwrights of this period. Sophocles and Aeschylus and Euripides, all these guys show up at the same time, and it creates a remarkable period of, what do I want to say, productivity and creativity in Athens. Thanks, Pastor. After him, we, in 495, the next year, the Temple of Mercury is built on what's called the Circus Maximus in Rome. The Circus Maximus isn't like a, like we think of a modern circus. It basically meant a circular track, but it wasn't really a complete circle. It was more like a bullet-shaped track. You started at one spot and ran a single length around and came to a stopping point after one, not even a complete circuit. Anyway, so the Temple of Mercury is this great thing, this great facility that's built there that really does put a lot of emphasis on the Circus Maximus and what it's going to mean to the people and the government of Rome. The next year, Rome decides to elect 2 tribunes of the plebs, as they're called, the plebeians, and 2 plebeian aediles. They're elected for the first time in Rome to sit in the office of what's called the tribunate. This is the year in 494, with the election of these plebeians, that Rome changes now from an aristocratic republic that's run by the patricians, the upper classes, and is now what becomes known as a liberalized republic. Liberalized simply meaning that everybody is represented, both the upper class and the lower class, the nobles and the so-called commoners. In 492, it's the first expedition of King Darius of Persia against Greece. And it's under the leadership of his son, Mardonius. And they began moving from faraway Persia, began marching this large army towards Greece. They've had enough of the Greeks. They've had enough of their insurrections. And now they're out to squash Greece once and for all. Not going to be the easy win they expect, because in 490 is the huge Battle of Marathon. At Marathon, of course, is where the Darius's troops are defeated by the Athenians and their allies, the Plataeans, under the Greek general Miltiades. One of the most famous things about the Battle of Marathon is, if we see image 2, this guy, Phidippides is his name. Phidippides winds up running 40 kilometers from Marathon, the battle site, to Athens, and there the highway that runs beside it now, and runners love to get their picture taken beside it. This guy runs the first marathon race, 40 kilometers from Marathon to Athens, to announce the news of the Greek victory. And of course, when he gets to Athens, he collapses with one word and says Nike, which means victory. The story goes that Phidippides died after that race, which now I can't imagine why anybody would want to imitate that feat. But Phidippides now becomes the great symbol of carrying victorious news, giving his life for it. And of course, Nike, we say in English, Nike. And we wind up with a tennis shoe and sporting goods company named after it. So in the 480s then, in 487, the Athenian archons become elected by a democratic vote. This is an important milestone in their moves towards what we call a radical Athenian democracy. Not radical in the, like we would think of radical today, but radical in the sense of now every citizen has a vote in Athens. They can vote for their archon. Not a representative government like Rome and us will have, we will have. No, this is pure democracy where every single person has a vote. The next year, way over in China, the first part of the Grand Canal of China is being built. I just threw that in there just to keep the Chinese involved. In that same year, 486, we have Xerxes I succeeding Darius I as the great king of Persia. During this time, the Egyptians will always look for an opportunity when there's a change in rulership of testing the new king, the new power. And so that same year that Darius has died, and Darius also in history is known as Darius the Great, even though failing miserably at the Battle of Marathon, still he was known as a great and just ruler. But now Xerxes will succeed him. And so Egypt, in that very same year, 486 BC, will begin a revolt against the Persian rule. And you can almost set your clock by it. Every time there's a new king, the Egyptians are going to revolt. The same year, way over in, how do you say it, Regaha in China is, in northern India, is the first Buddhist council that's actually held. We're not all that long after the death of the Buddha, and they're already now establishing a council to iron out what Buddhist doctrine is. And that was under the Indian king Ajatasattu, and he is the kind of the patron of this council, much in the same way that 800 years later, Constantine, the Roman emperor, will be the patron of the first Christian council at Nicaea. That same, no, 2 years later in 482, if we look at image 3, Pastor, the Athenian playwright Aeschylus wins his first poetry prize. Aeschylus is the guy who says, "He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, and in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God." Now, that was a thing that Robert Kennedy quoted, and that was one of the things that was always so impressive to me about Robert Kennedy, is that he could quote Plato and Aeschylus and Sophocles without no cards, without anything. He just, when he was actually giving that speech on the day of the death of Martin Luther King, it was supposed to be a political rally, and he winds up speaking to this audience. I think they were in Detroit, and he gives this quote. And it was just all an impromptu speech. But Aeschylus is one of those guys who writes so deeply, and I don't even know how to explain it. Sophocles is a wonderful writer. Euripides is a great writer, but there's something about Aeschylus. He goes on to write the book, write the play Agamemnon, which tells the story of after the war with Troy, after the action of the Iliad, that Agamemnon comes home, and it's what happens to him afterwards. He wrote the Orestian cycle, 3 plays based on the legend of Orestes. And also, arguably, some people dispute whether or not he wrote this, but he also wrote Prometheus Bound, the story of the Titan Prometheus, who did the unthinkable and actually brought fire and the knowledge of fire to human beings, and apparently it ticked off the gods. And so he's the first one that, or one of the first that we hear of being tormented in the realm of the underworld called Tartarus. Tartarus was the only place of torment in the Greek scheme of the afterlife. And it was always reserved for those gods and titans who had especially offended the gods. Prometheus is bound to a rock, and every day an eagle comes, some say a vulture, will come and actually like peck out his liver. And then as night falls, Prometheus, poor guy, has this regenerative liver that grows back, and the next day the vulture comes back and does it all over again, bound for eternity because of bringing human the knowledge of fire. Anyway, in 484, that same year, the Persians have regained control of Egypt, put down the revolt, so once again, Persia proves its might over the insurgent Egyptians. In 483, Gautama, the Buddha, dies. He has left. Now, remember, we just had a council only 3 years before, and it was kind of deciding who was going to follow what kind of Buddhism. Already in the life of Buddha, there was beginning to be different schools who were following different paths. The oldest path, known as Theravada Buddhism, was very, I'm going to say, conservative, and they were strictly following what only the Buddha taught. Another school will develop, known as Mahayana Buddhism, which becomes, again, when you start using phrases like liberal and conservative, it sounds like we're talking about, 21st century politics, and we're really not. I'm using liberal in the sense of they began expanding on the teachings of the Buddha. Because as far as the Buddhists are concerned, there wasn't just one Buddha, there was 6 of them. And there was one that was another born in Nepal, another one born in, even Japan is supposed to have had a Buddha there. And of course the Buddhas the Buddhists are awaiting the coming of the seventh Buddha, called Maitreya. Don't know if anybody remembers, but somewhere around 1982, there was articles, full-page ads taken out in like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune and Boston Globe, announcing the soon coming or the soon unveiling of Maitreya, the Buddha. And yeah, never saw anything. Nice try, a lot of fanfare, a lot of hype, no substance. So anyway, never got to see him. Then come to find out, the people who were behind that was really kind of a crackpot group, and you know. But then again, haven't we seen that in our own time where everybody, I remember in 1988, a guy wrote a book called 88 Reasons Why the Lord is Coming Back in 1988. Didn't happen. The next year was 89 Reasons Why the Lord is Coming Back in 1988. Didn't sell quite as many books as he did the first time out. So anyway, there's always this, you know, looking, longing, looking forward to all kinds of returns. Now, in that same year that the Buddha dies, Xerxes I, now son of Darius, starts planning an expedition against Greece. Darius had failed at the Battle of Marathon. Xerxes is now assembling, if you listen to the historians of the time, like Herodotus, sounds like he's gathering a 1 million person army. That's not out of all proportion, but it probably did not represent 1 million warriors. It probably represented something like 300,000 warriors, along with supply personnel, cooks, scavenger, or not scavengers, what's the word I want? Foragers, and you know, we're all adults, camp followers, lots of those. And in fact, a lot of times soldiers would actually bring their families along with them, you know, especially if there was no one to tend to them back home. So with this massive expedition, in 480, Xerxes starts off to conquer Greece. He's going to cross that thin strip of land called the Hellespont between Turkey, what is today Turkey, and Greece. They wind up building this bridge of boats, all connected together with planks running across them, and they march 1 million people. We'll stay with that number, 1 million, marching 1 million people across there. Now, the Greeks are not unaware of this, but the Greeks are in the middle of religious festivals, and they were so devout in it, they weren't going to go out and do anything. In August of that year, 480, the Persian fleet encounters the Greek fleet, and they fight kind of an inconclusive battle there. But now the Greeks know for sure that they're going to be on us pretty quick. Down in Sparta, the Spartan king, one of the two Spartan kings, named Leonidas, decides he's got to lead troops north and at least stall the Persians. Now, he's only got 300 Spartans. That's the famous number, and everybody knows about that. But he also had about 4,000 Phocians, there were Thracians, there were others. Still, all told, we're talking about probably no more than 7,000 troops. But the anchor of that army is the Spartans themselves, the greatest warriors probably ever. So in image 4, Pastor, on August 11th is the Battle of Thermopylae. Thermopylae just means the hot gates, because there was a hot springs that was close by. So you can see in the dotted area to the what am I saying? The right of it. That's where the Persian fleet was operating. But overland, you see where they're marching. So they get to Thermopylae, and Leonidas has found the perfect spot, because at that spot where you see the Greeks, gathered the blue block there, there's the the Gulf of Malis on the what would be their right-hand side, and then there's mountains and cliffs on the left-hand side. There's a small goat path that winds through those mountains and comes out behind the Greeks. But Leonidas sends the Phocians there to hold that line. Everything looks fine because the Persians don't know about that pass until, as always, a trader shows up and informs Xerxes and the Persians about that goat path. He thinks he's going to get wealth, and he does, but he also gets the undying infamy that goes with being a traitor. So Leonidas, with the 300 Spartans and the others, wind up holding on for 2.5 days, and would have held on for more, except now the Persians have found the goat path, and they begin sending a group that Xerxes called his immortals, who were his crack troops. They wind up winding their way around the Spartan position and coming in behind them. So the Spartans and Leonidas lets all the other Greeks go. He says, you guys aren't trained for this, we are. Because, as I told you before, the Spartan mothers always told their warrior sons, come home with your shield or on it. Meaning, you don't run, you don't surrender, you don't flee. And so these guys fight to the very last. One of the great lines is that Xerxes sends an ambassador to Leonidas, and he goes, you don't know what you're facing. He said, we have so many archers that our arrows will block out the sun. And Leonidas shrugs and he goes, then we will fight in the shade. But that's a tough guy for you. And so sure enough, all of them all the Spartans are killed. The Phocians and Thebans and some of the others are able to go back and carry this word. And still to this day, there's a plaque there at the hot gates where it says, tell them in Sparta, passerby, that here, according to our word, we lie. It becomes the great symbol of fighting against absolutely insurmountable odds. Still, it did what it was supposed to do. It bought enough time for the other Spartan troops, the Corinthians, the Athenian troops, the Plataeans, the Thebans, and the rest of them to really mobilize. But what they want to do is get get the Persians into a naval battle, because there they think they can make it more of an equal battle there, where numbers aren't really going to help because the Greeks know the waters, they know the currents, and they figure they're going to be able to have their best chance against the Persians in a naval fight. And sure enough, on September 23rd, we're only talking about 6 weeks later, 5 weeks later, is the Battle of Salamis between the Greeks and the Persians, which was a massive Greek victory. Xerxes was actually sitting on his ship watching it from a harbor and was mortified at watching his fleet go to the bottom. Still, the Persians aren't out of it yet. And the Battle of Salamis was, while we call it a Greek victory, was actually an Athenian victory because the Athenians were the big naval fighters. But in 479, the next year, at the Battle of Plataea, it's the Spartans now who, there's not just 300 of them, there are 10,000 Spartans. And when the Persians hear about that, they were like, oh, we got it handed to us by just 300 of them. Now there's 10,000 of them. And it winds up being the most catastrophic defeat that the Persians will face until the coming of Alexander the Great. This was where the Spartans were, if there was ever a remember the Alamo moment for the Spartans, it was this. They were remembering Thermopylae and the death of Leonidas. After the Battle of Plataea, the Persians fighting force has just about ceased to exist in Greece, and so Xerxes winds up heading home. In that same year, image 5, Pastor, just a quick look at the Chinese philosopher Confucius that we spoke a good bit about. He dies, and one of my favorite lines, he was asked to describe an idiot, and Confucius said, when the wise man points at the moon, the idiot looks at the finger. Holy smokes, that is just as true today as it was way back in 479. So anyway, Confucius is now passed away, having influenced not just Chinese politics, but all of Asian politics for so long. In the next year, the Temple of Confucius will be established at the modern day city is called Khufu. Sounds like Confucius, but remember, Confucius' real name is Kung Fu Zu. Now, in 477, the Delian League is inaugurated. The Delian League winds up, they call it that because in the Greek city of Delos is where this self-defense treasury was kept. And the Delian League is formed by the Greek city-states who join together against any further incursions of the Persians. And one of the guys who had led that was a guy named Themistocles. And if we'll look at image 6, Pastor, Themistocles in 471 winds up being booted out. He was, we talked about the word ostracized before, and that's when a small slate called an ostracon, they have the name, and you can see actually that top line there is in Greek Themistocles, and he was ostracized. Enough of the citizens turned in these small stones, these ostracons, with his name written on it, and so enough of them did that to boot out poor Themistocles, this guy who had done so much to save them against the Persians and to create this defense league. Still, the Greeks thought he was getting, or the Athenians thought he was getting a little too much power, and out he goes. So then in 469, now we have one of the most important Greeks ever, and that's image 7, Pastor. The Greek philosopher Socrates is born in Athens, in Greece. Socrates is, the most famous line, at least for me, from him is, "The unexamined life is not worth living." He is the one who says, examine everything, question everything. Just because everyone before you believed a thing doesn't mean that that thing is true. Now, we know that Socrates never wrote anything, at least nothing that we have, and nothing that was ever reported. But most of the words from Socrates that we have came from his student, Plato. And a lot of times you kind of get the feeling that Plato revered Socrates so much that Plato simply took his words and put them in the mouth of Socrates. Still, Socrates was so important and so influential that the Athenian government will turn against him because the Athenian government was sure that as long as they were in control of education, that they could make nice little citizens. Socrates said, no, do not believe what they tell you. He tells the young people of Athens, his students, you have to question everything and find the answers for yourself. Before it's all over with, Socrates is going to be put to death, and the charge was for corrupting the youth of Athens because he told them to think for themselves. What a radical. Well, in 468, we have Sophocles, the guy we talked about a minute ago, and Aeschylus vying for the Athenian prize. And believe it or not, Sophocles actually wins this prize, the Athenian prize, against Aeschylus. It kind of set Sophocles up as like the great Greek playwright. 2 years later, 466, the Delian League defeats Persia at the Battle of Eurymedon. So even though the Persians are not on Greek soil, so to speak, they're still fighting it out on the high seas. And the Delian League now is able to create these ships that actually, and this was at the Spartan direction, these ships aren't just there to ram each other or to hurl what they called Greek fire at each other, but rather they could create land battles on the sea because they would have these planks that had hooks underneath, that they would drop these planks from the Greek ship to the Persian ship, and after they had been drawn in close with grappling hooks, they would drop these planks across that would then lock the two ships together, and the Spartans would then come and fight basically a land battle against the Persian sailors. They weren't ready for any of that stuff. So the Delian League was able to use the naval skills of the Athenians along with the land fighting skills of the Spartans. The next year, Xerxes is murdered by a guy named Artabanus. Artabanus the Hyrcanian. Yeah. And so Artabanus the Hyrcanian is not of a noble line, but the next king is named Artaxerxes I, and he's young enough that it looks like Artabanus was kind of acting as the power behind the throne, acting as the regent. Now, in 464 BC, in Sparta, there's this massive earthquake that takes place that leads to a revolt of a group known as the Helots. And the Helots were, well, the only thing to call them is a slave class. It led to this slave uprising in Greece. In fact, trying to think of the historian now, but he said if we wonder what became of the Spartans and the glory of Sparta, never forget that the Helots outnumbered the Spartans 20-1. The Helot revolts throughout Sparta's history was always going to be a bit of a problem. And it actually caused strained relations with Athens. And that is going to eventually lead to what we're going to call the Peloponnesian War, the war between Sparta and Athens. Well, in 464, only 1 year after Artabanus had murdered Xerxes I, Artaxerxes, the young king, actually has Artabanus killed, put to death, not a murder, but an execution. So what happens? You guessed it, the Egyptians revolt. We've got a new king, so we've got a new opportunity, and it actually starts a 6-year war. And during this, there was an Athenian fleet that had been sent out to attack Cyprus, but now they're diverted and sent down to Egypt to help fight against the Persians there. So the Greeks wind up fighting these proxy wars with the Persians and all these other places that are trying to revolt against Persia. That same year, a guy in Rome named Cincinnatus becomes a consul, one of the two chief executive powers of the Roman Republic. And he will serve a couple of terms, but he will eventually be given the powers of dictator. Now, if you remember correctly, dictator is not like Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin. When the Romans are talking about a dictator back then, they're talking about somebody who is given complete executive and military powers for the duration of a conflict, usually an external conflict. Cincinnatus is going to be one of the first of those. The same year, over in Greece, over in Kos, Greece, we have a famous guy being born named Hippocrates, the father of medicine, as he's called, although certainly people have been practicing medicine for thousands of years already. The next year, in 459 BC, Ezra, now we're finally talking about Bible stuff again, Ezra winds up leading another expedition of the Jews from Babylon back to Jerusalem. Remember, there will be several, and there's already been two before, and now Ezra leads it's actually the second large return to Jerusalem, but there will be many smaller ones too that take place along the way. Ezra will head back, released from Babylon by Artaxerxes, and he will go back then, and they will start rebuilding the city all over again. Ezra and Nehemiah will have a bit of a jaded view about about foreigners. In fact, it's Ezra and Nehemiah who are going to say, and remember, in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are not two books, they're one book. It's called Ezra Nehemiah. And it's in Ezra Nehemiah that you wind up hearing things like put away the foreign wives and put away the foreign children, because they were really wanting to kind of have a purity of the bloodlines all over again. And you'll actually have others like the book of Jonah and the book of Ruth who will be saying, no, we should accept the foreigner. In fact, remember, Ruth is from Moab. She's not even Jewish, and yet she becomes the grandmother of their greatest king, King David. So there winds up being kind of two opinions regarding external influences. Ezra and Nehemiah are sick to death of the Babylonians and the Persians and everybody else, and they're saying, look, it ought to be just us, let's cut everybody else loose. Jonah said, look, even the Assyrians, as hated as they were, they are still loved by God and should be loved by us. And the book of Ruth was saying, hey, look, even the grandmother of the great king was a foreigner, so of course we have to welcome the foreigner. Well, that's Ezra. In 458, the Greek playwright Aeschylus that we just talked about will finish that cycle, that trilogy called the Orestia, the plays of that tells the story of a family blood feud that goes on, and these plays will have huge influence on future writers, not just future writers in Greece, but future writers in Rome and in the rest of, even in the modern world. In fact, I can't remember the play now, but there was a play that had come out, had been premiered in New York City, and I remember a New York Times playwright saying, yeah, I liked it the first time I read it when it was written by Aeschylus. Yeah, still a big influence. Now, in that same year, 458, Cincinnatus, like I told you, was named dictator of the Roman Republic to defend against an attack from the Equi, a tribe in Italy. 16 days later, after he defeats the Equi at the Battle of Mount Algidus, he resigns. He doesn't wait for the whole 6 months to end, because that's what a dictatorship usually amounts to, 6 months. The conflict was over. The Equi had been defeated, and so he resigns and returns back to his farm. Now that Cincinnatus is the model of the Roman dictator. You take care of the problem, and when it's done, go back to what you were doing before. That sets such a great standard that later there will be another problem, and Cincinnatus will have to be called up again, but they knew they could trust the guy. That won't happen every time. There will be dictators who will come in and decide they don't want to give up power, at least not for the whole 6 months, and some of them will try to get it extended beyond that. Well, in 457, the very next year, back over in Athens, Pericles institutes his greatest democratic reform, and that's when he allows common people to serve in any state office. Anybody can be elected to archon, to any of the priest positions, to any of the governmental offices, is now open to even the common people. it begins what we call the golden age of Athens. And in this golden, I talk about how when all these characters show up at one time, that here in Athens we have Pericles, who is the great statesman, at the same time as we have the great playwrights, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. Socrates is there. The scientist Anaxagoras was there. All these guys, and they could see them. Can you imagine at the plays, the dramas that they would hold? The front row was always saved for this group, and the play didn't begin until you saw Pericles and Socrates and Sophocles and Aeschylus and Anaxagoras and the rest of them all coming and taking their seats. Holy smokes. I'd like to go to that after play party. So that very same year, Artaxerxes I has issued a decree to reestablish the city government of Jerusalem. Now, that's recorded in Ezra chapter 7, in Daniel chapter 9, in Nehemiah, actually chapter 1 of Nehemiah, our Nehemiah. And it's all of those talk about this great event that now Jerusalem has its own city government again. Now, they are under the thumb of the Persians, no doubt about it. But it becomes a, they call it a satrapy, a kind of a district or a state of the Persian Empire. But Jerusalem now and the kingdom of what had once been Judah and Israel will now be administered by a local government in Jerusalem. It's a big deal. In 455, Euripides presents his first known tragedy called the Pleiades at the Athenian festival of Dionysus. But the next year, Athens loses a fleet. Remember that fleet that was diverted from Cyprus to go down and help against help the Egyptians in their revolt against Persia? Well, that fleet loses about 50,000 troops and sailors in this failed attempt to get rid of Persia. In 451, Athens and Greece begin to try to make, Athens makes peace with Sparta and begins to wage a new war against Persia. Back over in Rome, in the very same year, a group known as the Decemviri, which is 10, it means 10 men, they come to power in the Roman Republic, and they enact what's called the 12 Tables, which becomes the foundation of Roman law. Now, that's a big deal because Roman law is going to directly influence British law. And British law and Roman law is going to directly affect American law. Our system of government, our Constitution, our laws are direct descendants from Roman through British law. You hear words like veto. That's a Latin word that means I refuse. In our place, in our government, the president can veto a law. I can refuse this law, and then it takes, of course, a 2/3 majority to overturn his veto. In Rome, the tribune, especially the tribune of the plebs, who was the representative of the masses, the common folk, could say, no, I refuse this law because it is oppressive to the lower class people, and they had to accept it. So it was a very fair form of government for both classes. 2 years later, in 449, the Peace of Callias is finally signed between the Delian League, remember the Greek League, the Defense League, and Persia, and thus effectively ends the Persian Wars. Now, that means the Persian Wars of the nation of Greece against Persia. There will be others who are going to fight against Persia fiercely. Now, in that same year, He's called the father of history. Herodotus completes his book called The Histories, which records the events of the Persian War. It's one of the first great histories that has come down to us. Next year, over in Athens, a guy named Phidias, this great sculpture, finishes a, oh goodness, it's about 30 feet high. Well, okay, technically it's 28 feet high. A statue of Athena that goes on to the Acropolis. Remember that hill in the center of Athens. The next year, Athens begins construction of the Parthenon, and if we can see image 8, Pastor, and the Parthenon is that great building that you'll see here that everybody can recognize. And this was one of the public works programs established by Pericles. This is the Parthenon as it looks now, of course. Before, there was the great roof, there was all like that. I could spend a long time talking about the Parthenon, but this was another great spot where it was dedicated to Athena, which of course the city of Athens is named after Athena. The Parthenon is named after Athena, but that's because Parthenon is referring to the Virgin, and Athena was known as the Virgin Goddess. She was the goddess of wisdom and war. A lot can be said about her being wise because being a virgin means she never took a husband. That made her wise, apparently, at least in Greek thinking. You can confirm or deny that in your own head. Now, so that is a part of the public works established by Pericles. And it's because of Pericles that the unemployment in Athens is going to go to almost zero, because all these great works are going to be built. All these new harbors are being built. There's dredging that's going on. Everybody has got work in Athens thanks to Pericles. Pardon me. In 445 BC, Pericles then declares a 30-year peace agreement between Athens and Sparta. Even though they had enjoyed a common enemy with the Persians, now that the Persians are not really a threat because of the peace of Callias that had been signed, Pericles realizes we better secure a peace with with Sparta, because things are going to get pretty ugly pretty quick. In that same year, jump back over to Persia, Artaxerxes I gives Nehemiah permission to go home and rebuild Jerusalem's walls. We know that the temple had already been rebuilt. We know that Ezra has gone back and helped reestablish the government in Jerusalem. And now Nehemiah is able to go home and rebuild the walls. What makes that important is that it also secures the defense capabilities of Jerusalem. I mean, with no walls, armies can just walk in and out. Now, while Jerusalem is definitely under the protectorship of Persia, still, Nehemiah is no dummy, and he knows that, look, Egyptians revolt every chance they get. The Greeks, you never know when they're going to come knocking again. So Jerusalem is looking out for its own defense should anything happen to the Persians. In 442, Sophocles writes his famous book, I think it's part 3 of the Oedipus cycle, called Antigone. But in 440, there is a huge famine in Rome, and Rome begins to realize that they are having a hard time producing enough food for this growing population there in Rome. That's going to fuel a lot of Rome's expansion in trying to find other places to feed Rome or to import food. That's going to lead eventually, we're still a few hundred years away, but eventually Rome is going to look to Egypt as the source of their wheat imports. In the same year of that famine, over in Greece, a guy named Democritus, a scientist, proposes the idea of everything we see being built on invisible particles, and he calls them atomes, atoms. So we have the science of atoms being proposed as early as 440 BC. In 439, Cincinnatus is back again as the dictator of the Roman Republic, and during his term, he defeats another group known as the Volsci. Pardon me. Again, he's done, resigns, back to the farm. The next year, they'll finish building the Parthenon, and then in 435, if we'll look at image 9, Pastor, Phidias, the guy who made that 30-foot or 28-foot tall statue of Athena, has completed, and this is an artist rendering, of course, but based on models that they had found, this is what the temple I should say, the statue of Olympian Zeus by Phidias looked like. That was finally completed, and it comes to be known as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Other wonders, of course, will include the pyramids, the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the Pharos of Alexandria, the whatever else. Stevie Wonder's second album. Now that's the modern world. So now this guy Phidias has become not just rich, but incredibly influential too. In 434, the next year, Anaxagoras, the mathematician and scientist we talked about, has tried to square the circle using only a straight edge and a compass. It was just kind of I don't know, that's one of those odd things that I kind of like. In 432, Athens will adopt a 19-year cycle synchronizing solar and lunar calendars. It's a pretty good experiment, but it doesn't turn out so hot. But and it also makes for really confusing dating of trying to figure out exactly what was happening in Athens exactly when, because of this odd calendar. Now, the next year, 431, the Peloponnesian War begins between Sparta and Athens and the allies of all of them. In image 10, Pastor, basically you can see what happens with the Peloponnesian War is you wind up with Sparta, who's down on that, okay, the orange, that's going to be the Spartan Confederacy. The blue is called the Athenian League. Most of the blue, of course, are naval powers. The orange is going to be like Sparta and Thebes and Corinth and Megara and Olympia, and they're all land fighters. There's going to be battles all over the place. Even Sparta is going to try to take on Athens on the seas, and at least on some of these islands. And the war will actually carry over into, if you look on the far left-hand side, to the island of Sicily, which has gotten, I mean, Syracuse, remember, was a Spartan outpost. And, well, the ones in red are all Spartans, and the ones in blue are the Athenian, I don't want to say outposts, I want to say colonies. That's it. So anyway, that war is going to rage on for a good long time, and it's going to be all over, not only just Greece, but also over in Sicily, also over on the far right-hand side in Asia Minor on the coast there. Oh no. Okay, so what winds up happening is that the Spartans wind up defeating the Athenians because the Athenians wind up having a plague strike them, which will knock them out once and for all. Okay, I'm going to skip a few images. In 428, Plato is born. Big deal. Yeah, let me see image 11, Pastor.
There.
One of my favorite quotes: "We can easily forgive a child who is afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when men are afraid of the light." Yeah. Okay, so let's see. The war with Athens and Sparta, it goes back and forth. The two of them just go at each other for so many years. but finally, a guy named Alcibiades, and later General Patton will consider himself a reincarnation of Alcibiades, is elected the strategos of the Athenians and begins dominating the Athenian politics. He will wind up signing a peace treaty with with Sparta, but Sparta will wind up breaking that treaty, and will eventually, Sparta will overrun the Athenians at the Battle of Mantinea, the biggest battle of the Athenian War. But the next year, no, not the next year, in 412 BC, the Persians start preparing another invasion of Ionia, that coast on Asia Minor, Turkey, and the Spartans actually sign an armistice or a treaty with the Persians, because now the Persians have seen that if we jump in against the Athenians, the Spartans are going to support us. Well, okay. Sorry. Well, the Carthaginians will wind up flexing their muscles. They're going to wind up being the ones who are competing against Rome. And then, but finally, over about the year 405, the Spartan king Pausanias lays siege to the city of Athens and starves the city out. And after about a 9-month siege, Athens surrenders to Sparta and ends the Peloponnesian War once and for all. In 403, the Athenians will adopt the Ionian alphabet. That's image 12, Pastor. Just a quick look at that. That's kind of what we now recognize to be the Greek alphabet. But if you'll pay attention to, let's see, number 6. Oh, well, it actually says underneath. The letters of Vau and Kappa and Sampi are now obsolete characters. They're not used in, they were used in what we call Attic Greek, but Koine Greek, which is the language of the New Testament, is going to drop those letters, and even modern Greek won't have those anymore. Okay, so that was just because it's interesting to me. The Carthaginians now see an opportunity to move into Sicily, because the Athenian and Spartan colonies there have been so weakened by the war, that the Peloponnesian War, that the Carthaginians see an opportunity to move in. They take the island of Malta also, and now Cyrus the Younger, as he's called, rebels against the Persian king Artaxerxes II, but he's killed in battle, and he had hired Greek mercenaries, actually Spartan mercenaries, and now these Spartan mercenaries are kind of left on their own, and they got to make their way back to Greece. A guy named Xenophon writes a book called The Persian Expedition that is one of the most remarkable books ever. And these guys, these Spartans, who they numbered about 20,000, were having to march all the way out of the Persian Empire. And according to Xenophon, they fought a battle every day on this march out. And it took them like 5 months to march out of there. And even as they're crossing the last hill, another Persian force is on their trail. But when they get to that last hill and they're able to look out over the Black Sea, they see that the Spartans and the Greeks have actually created a beachhead. And so the Spartans are able to run down to the shore and finally link up with a relieving force. And the Persians realize, no, not going to take these guys on. And so the Persians turn around and go home. It was absolutely incredible. In the 300s, and in 399, the century begins with the death of Socrates. As most of you know, he was made to drink the hemlock. That was his execution for as they said, corrupting the youth of Athens. That same year, way over in Mongolia, a group known as the Swing Nu begins to start dominating other tribes. We don't call them that. We call them the Huns. And they will wind up dominating not just Mongolia, they're going to wind up for the next 200 years, eventually taking over and dominating all of northern China. Now, you know that by the year 444 AD, Attila the Hun winds up attacking Rome and squares off against Pope Leo I. And Leo, don't know what he said, nobody ever knows, but he eventually convinced Attila to turn around and leave. Well, that all begins back here in 399. In 395, there winds up being the Corinthian War. Athens and Persians and other Greek city-states are starting to challenge Sparta one more time. Not going to work. Image 13, Pastor, in 384, just because this guy needs to be mentioned, Aristotle is born. And Aristotle is the student of Plato, had been a part of Plato's academy. And it's Aristotle who is the great scientist and philosopher. But yeah, my favorite is educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. He was the guy who talked about a well-rounded education. And when we think about the educational system we have today, where we have, athletics, arts, science, language, all that, and history, of course, that was Aristotle's curriculum, was we all need to know all those things in order to be, he said, a productive citizen. The 2 years later, after the birth of Aristotle, a guy named Philip II is born. He will become the king of Macedon, and he will create a fighting unit that is prepared to take on the Persians. It's a formation known as the phalanx, and the phalanx is heavily armed and heavily armored infantry troops with long spears that fight in tight formation that could take on chariots, elephants, cavalry, anything. He will never get to use it, but his son certainly will. We'll talk about him in a minute. The last real Egyptian dynasty, the 30th dynasty, dies out in 380. After that, there will be Persians, there will be certainly Greeks that will come along, but in 380, the 30th dynasty is the last one to be considered a completely Egyptian dynasty. In 370, and this, again, image 14, Pastor, it's the first Roman roads that are built. The Roman roads will run from Rome to the Alban Hills and is usually used as to carry military traffic. If you can, this is what a Roman road looked like. It started with, you see number 4 on the very bottom, this lime mortar and sand was laid to form this base to level out so the Roman roads, you could practically run a plumb line from one end of the road to the other, and it's going to be level until, of course, you get to certain elevations. And then this lime that was kind of a lime concrete that had like broken up stones, heavier stones, was put next. Then on top of that was concrete and with gravel and coarse sand, also mixed with lime, put on top of that. And then finally, the whole surface is covered with bricks, or actually stone blocks. Those roads, I saw an image that had a road that was built in 2015 next to a Roman road that was built back here in almost 400 BC, and the Roman road was in much better shape than the asphalt road. Anyway, the Romans will use these to move troops quickly and military gear to travel these flat roads. What it's also going to do is going to allow pedestrian travel at a much safer rate, because eventually they will establish what we would call a highway patrol system, that every mile and a half there was a station of a garrison of Roman troops, so that people could travel safely without worrying about bandits. That will happen a little bit later, but it's the beginning of these roads that make it so important. Now, in 359, Philip, who is technically the regent of Macedonia, but they call him King Philip, and it reorganized the army into the strongest one in Greece, is kind of getting drawn into these quarrels between the Greek city-states. But he winds up actually expanding his kingdom as he acts like he's coming to the aid of everybody else. In 356, his son, Alexander III, is born. History will call him Alexander the Great. In 350, just as another look at what's going on the other side of the world, the Chinese invent the crossbow. Europe won't have it until much, much later, 1,000 years later. But yep, Chinese have the crossbow. In 348, Rome will sign their first treaty with Carthage, which will kind of lay out where Carthage can expand and where Rome can expand. That's not going to last a whole long time. In 346, the peace treaty of Philip's forces Athens to accept the peace treaty with Macedon, and one which is very favorable to the Macedonians. And this is the beginning of the end of Greek independence. We'll wind up having over in Persia a new king, Artaxerxes III. We've kind of skipped past some of the others, and of course, Egypt revolts. But Artaxerxes will recapture Egypt and will establish a Persian dynasty, which is technically known as the 31st dynasty. But remember, the last one, the 30th, was the last pure Egyptian one. In 338, Philip defeats the Athenians. He defeats the army of Thebes at Chaeronea. And finally, all of Greece is under Philip's rule. In 336, Artaxerxes is assassinated, and his son Darius III comes to the throne. Darius III will be the weakest of all the Persian kings. And Philip and Alexander know this. It was almost like this was a dream come true for them. That very same year that Artaxerxes is assassinated, Philip will also be assassinated. So now Darius III is on the Persian throne. Alexander the Great is on, and if we can see image 15, Pastor, Alexander the Great is now come to the throne of Macedon. And 2 years later, armed with this army, there's Alexander, sometimes called the Boy King, because he wasn't very old when he started his military exploits. He had become a corps commander for Philip when he was only when Alexander was only 16 years old. Yeah, he is one of those who burns bright but burns fast. So now, with Philip's great phalanx system, with his own hand-picked troops called the Companions, in 334, Alexander launches his campaign against the Persians. He crosses over the very same spot where Xerxes I had crossed into Greece. There, Alexander is crossing over now, ready to invade the Persian Empire. He gets to a place where there is this knot that had been tied together with ropes. This is one of the truly telling stories of Alexander. The plaque underneath this huge knot said, "He who unravels this knot," I think it says unravels the mystery of this knot, "will own Asia." And everybody, his generals were like, so, think you can unravel that knot? Alexander said, of course I can. And he draws his sword and slashes through the knot. That's my guy. That's thinking outside the box. So yeah, we got no time for any stinking knot puzzles. Just slash through it. So that same year, Alexander will encounter the Persians for the first time at the Battle of Granicus Bridge. Alexander has an army of 35,000 soldiers fighting against an army led by Darius that was probably about 50,000 soldiers. And hard-fought battle and all that, but Alexander's troops are so mobile, so fast, so able to handle the Persian chariots that they captured or killed half of the Persian army, and Darius is forced to retreat. Let's move on another 100 miles. At the Battle of Issus, Alexander's forces meet another Persian army, this time 500,000 troops. 35,000 against 500,000. Now, what did Leonidas teach us at the Battle of Thermopylae? Pick your ground. Like at Thermopylae, when 300 Spartans are lined up in 3 ranks because of the small space, then the Persians can't commit 300,000 troops at one time. They can only commit 1,000 troops at a time. Those are better odds. Alexander follows the same kind of idea. Picking a line and attacking the Persian center, at the center of the lines, and then using his very mobile cavalry to start cutting off the flanks of Darius's army. And once again, it was an overwhelming victory, and Darius has to ride home pretty fast. The next year is the climactic battle, the Battle of Gaugamela, sometimes called the Battle of Arbela. And Darius has made, here's where the Persian army is going to make a final stand in October of 331 BC at Gaugamela. And it's actually in the heart of Assyrian territory. There's nearly 1 million troops, and this time we're not talking about camp followers. We're not talking about engineers. We're not talking about cooks. And no, there are 1 million fighting troops who are facing off against Alexander's 50,000. Alexander had gotten some reinforcements based on some of the cities that he had liberated from the Persians. Now these guys are coming over to fight on Alexander's side. Alexander obtained great pre-battle intelligence on the disposition of the Persian troops, and so he's able to attack the Persians, disrupting their lines everywhere, which just caused this general Persian retreat. Darius flees the battlefield, but he was pursued, and eventually his own people assassinated him in Bactria. The Persian Empire is done. Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great, and Israel now comes under the rule of Alexander. The city of Tyre decided to hold out against Alexander. He winds up laying siege to the city. It took too long. He brutally murdered the king of Tyre, and that's the end of the Phoenician Empire. All the remnants of the Persian Empire fall to Alexander, and when Alexander gets to Egypt, the Egyptians are like, oh, thank God it's somebody besides a Persian. And Alexander loves Egypt, and they loved him, and he began building a new city at the Nile Delta, of course, Alexandria, Egypt. That will become the site of a great library, of course. That'll become the site of a new Jewish Sanhedrin court, because there will be a massive Jewish settlement there. And now, in 327, Alexander begins his invasion of India. He fights a battle against a general named Porus, and it's a close battle. And Porus does very well. He's defeated, of course. It's Alexander after all. But Alexander then puts Porus, kind of taking a page out of Cyrus the Great, Alexander names Porus as his regent in India. But now as the book by Arrian called The Campaigns of Alexander, it says, and when Alexander surveyed the breadth and depth of his empire, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. So he turns around and goes back to Persia, back to Persepolis, and in 324, at the age of 33 years of age, Alexander has contracted some fever, and as he's on his deathbed, his generals all gather around and said, so to whom do you bequeath your empire? And his last words are, to the strongest. And he dies. Oh, that's great. Which is why the empire of Alexander, which should have lasted 1,000 years, winds up falling into fragments after that. His body is taken back to Alexandria, Egypt, and Alexander is buried there. Now, what happens is you wind up with all of his generals starting to carve out different areas for themselves. Ptolemy calls himself Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the Savior. Yeah, all right. He becomes a pharaoh in Alexandria, Egypt, establishes his capital there. And so this is now the family, the family of the Ptolemies, who are going to be ruling Egypt all the way up until the coming of Julius Caesar and the Romans. So when Caesar meets the king of Egypt, he's meeting Ptolemy the 16th. And Ptolemy's sister is, of course, Cleopatra. Well, it becomes known as the War of the Diadochi. Over all these conquered lands, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus will take Syria, and he winds up having the largest part of the empire. Oh goodness, there's Antigonus, who winds up taking a lot of Macedon and Asia Minor. Anyway, they start then carving out this new, it comes to be known as the Hellenistic period. Greek now is the language that becomes the most important language, taking over from Aramaic, which Cyrus had made the language of, or Darius the First had made the language of the western part of the empire. But now Greek becomes the language of Egypt, the language of Syria and Palestine, as it will be called. And so the three big kings will be Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus, and Antigonus. Back over in Rome, or I'm sorry, not in Rome, over in India, in the same time, we have the beginnings of a new dynasty and a new kingdom called the Mauryan dynasty. And it started by a guy named Chandragupta Maurya. He will overthrow a guy named Nanda, who was the ruler of the Magadha kingdom along the Ganges River. And so the Mauryans will control northern and central India and create a dynasty and an amazing kingdom all their own. Still, most of the world is paying attention to what's happening with the Hellenistic kingdoms. And now two of Alexander's generals will split Greece. Antigonus will take the north, and Demetrius, the first, will take the southern part, which is Athens and Sparta and all those. And in 306, just in case we've forgotten, Rome and Carthage will sign another treaty, because now these Hellenistic generals have started to make things a little more difficult for them. So the two of them are establishing what they're going to be carving out. Okay. In 301, Antigonus tries to reunite all of Alexander's empire under his control. He invades Egypt, but yeah, he winds up being defeated. And even his son, who is Demetrius that we just talked about, is also defeated at that time. In 300, finally, something intellectual is happening. Euclid publishes his book called The Elements. And where is Euclid living? Alexandria. All the best and the brightest are starting to head to Alexandria now. This book, The Elements, is actually, it's the first time that principles of geometry are laid out in such detail. It winds up being a 13-volume book. No, I have not read it. Only part of it. I read the excerpt. In 300, just another interesting thing, Japan starts farming rice. You would have thought that had been going on all along, but no, in 300, they are finally figuring out how to do that. And also in that same year, Latin now becomes the dominant language of the Italian peninsula. It wins out over Etruscan, it wins out over all the rest of it. In 297, that lighthouse in Alexandria is built. And also, 10 years later, Archimedes is the Greek mathematician. Remember, he's the guy who sat in the tub and saw that water was displaced according to his body mass. And what was it he said? Oh, Eureka. Yeah, I found it. He says, oh, yeah, so the displacement of water is directly correlated to the mass of the, what's being said in there. To us, it seems like a no-brainer. It took them a while to figure it out. Go figure. Now, by 278, there are 3 Hellenistic kingdoms that are left. That is to say, carved from Alexander's empire. The Seleucids are in Babylonia and Syria. The Antigonids are in Macedonia, and the Ptolemies are in Egypt. Another wonder of the world, the Colossus of Rhodes, was finished in 275. But in 273, and that's in did I say 273? Yeah, 273. Image 16 is King Ashoka. He's the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, the Mauryan dynasty. And it was starting in 268, and he will rule for 36 years. And I mean, this is a bust from that era. He's a good-looking devil, and he will become the great king. He's known as Ashoka the Great. And H.G. Wells, in his book called The Outline of History, published in like 1920, he said, amidst the tens of thousands of names of monarchs that crowd the columns of history, all their majesties, their graciousnesses, their serenities, their royal highnesses, and the like, the name of Ashoka shines almost alone like a star. Well, that's high praise from a guy who wrote this massive book on the histories. And he says, Alexander the Great, Cyrus the Great, all those guys, yeah, forget it. This is the guy you should look at. He was remarkable. He was a Buddhist, and he ruled his kingdom on Buddhist principles. Really kind of an amazing character, and one that, in the West, we rarely pay attention to. By 265, Rome has dominated all the Italian peninsula, and they begin pursuing a much larger empire now. Now they're looking down towards Sicily. They're looking to cross over into what today we would call France. And now, in 264, the two powers of the Mediterranean, at least of the Western Mediterranean, Carthage and Rome, go to war. In 264, it's the First Punic War, it's called. Punic coming from the word Phoenician because Carthage was a Phoenician colony. And in 250, the Hebrew scriptures are translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. Where does it take place? Alexandria, Egypt. That's where they begin. Again, another Sanhedrin has already been established there. And Judea in 198 is now under the control of the Seleucids. They had been taken by Ptolemy in Egypt, by the Ptolemies, but now the Seleucids have taken them over under Antiochus III and Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV will refer to himself as Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus, God in the flesh. Okay, Well, he becomes in 175 now, 22 years later, or 23 years later. Antiochus IV Epiphanes becomes the king of the Seleucid Empire. Within only 8 years, he begins a persecution of the Jews. He will have the high priest put to death and will set in his own high priest. And it's during this time, in 165, that the book of Daniel is finally written. Daniel is the last of the Old Testament books. When we read Daniel, it's the story of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, but it's not about Nebuchadnezzar. It's actually about Antiochus IV. In the book of Daniel, we read about the abomination of desolation. Why? Because in 166, Antiochus went into the temple in Jerusalem and actually sacrificed pigs on the altar. All right, now you know that the Jews think that pigs are unclean. And so for this, it was just, well, abomination. That a king would do that to a people whose sensibilities rejected any such notion. It just led to then a revolt. So Daniel is actually talking about what's going on under Antiochus. When it talks about the anointed one being removed, yeah, a lot of people want to read it forward and talk about it something futuristic, that it's about Christ or it's about whatever. No, it's about the high priest Onias III, who had been removed by Antiochus. Well, the next year, 164, Judas Maccabeus and his sons, and Maccabeus, what a great name. It means the hammer. Judas the Hammer leads a revolt, defeats the Assyrians, frees Jerusalem, and while the city had been under siege, there had been no oil getting in. And so the menorah, the candle in the temple, had no oil, and yet it burned for 8 days without any oil. Certainly a miracle. So after the relieving of the city of Jerusalem, oil comes back in. Now we have, it's called the Festival of Lights. The Jews call it Hanukkah, or actually Hanukkah, but never mind that. So where does that celebration come from? It comes from the liberation of the city of Jerusalem from the oppression of those who would really try to eradicate all of the Jews. Well, in 160, Judas Maccabeus is killed in battle against the Syrians, the Seleucids, and his brother Jonathan then takes over. In 157, the Maccabean revolt has secured the independence of Judea one more time. It will be the Maccabeans who will, or the Maccabees, who will rule the kingdom. And so Judea has seen independence for the first time in hundreds of years. Sadly, that's not going to last very long because the Romans will eventually come to town. But with Alexander, with all that, now Greek language has made a change, Greek culture has made a change, and it actually really does prepare for the coming and the message of Jesus. A temple has been rebuilt, and people have realized that the kingdoms of this world are not going to secure us. Caesar couldn't do it. Alexander couldn't do it. Rome couldn't do it, or wouldn't do it. And that's why Jesus will say, yeah, my kingdom is not of this world. Because looking at all the history that we've looked at over the last 5 classes is empires and kingdoms and generals and armies come and go, but it's the ideas that stick around. The ideas of the playwrights and the scientists and the mathematicians that we've talked about. That's what lasts. And that's why Jesus said, yeah, I can give you water that you will never thirst again. So here we are at the end, and next time we talk, it's the Romans and their turn.